Help me out here, Congresswoman. Representative John Kennedy began his remarks without a single trace of urgency, casually brushing himself off as nothing more than a simple rural attorney who had been puzzling over a specific set of items for the entire morning. In one hand, he held up a white garment, boasting the $27 slogan to heavily tax the wealthy. Right beside it, he presented an extravagant hotel invoice that vastly exceeded that $27 price tag, openly declaring his complete inability to comprehend which of these two conflicting artifacts represented the actual Congresswoman. He displayed the inexpensive, slightly creased white t-shirt bearing three prominent red words designed to be seen from the furthest bleachers, as though it were a crucial exhibit in a grand trial. He slowly rotated the fabric in his hands, handling it with the careful hesitation of a craftsman examining a completely unfamiliar instrument, before laying it completely flat and gently smoothing out the wrinkles with two fingers. Seated directly across the table, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez observed his every deliberate motion, and for the absolute first time that entire morning, she found herself completely devoid of words. To truly comprehend how a prominent political figure who constructed an entire global brand upon a simple three-word phrase was ultimately defeated by those exact same words, one must rewind the clock approximately 2 minutes. We must return to the precise moment when she genuinely still believed the humble country lawyer was completely incapable of basic mathematics. The setting that morning was a standard, low-ceilinged chamber on the second floor of the Longworth building. The environment was illuminated by the flat, unyielding hum of fluorescent lights shining down on a committee table that had witnessed 4 decades of politicians attempting to explain their actions. The official agenda was centered on campaign finance transparency, which is typically the exact sort of mundane, bureaucratic necessity that completely empties a room rather than packing it out. Yet, on this specific day, the chamber was filled to absolute capacity. Camera crews were stationed 3 rows deep against the back wall, their recording indicators glowing with a steady red intensity. The heavy media presence was entirely due to circulating rumors that Kennedy had explicitly requested to join the cross-examination panel, and that he had specifically asked for her by name. Hidden amidst the crowd, sitting somewhere in the 4th row wearing an out-of-season cardigan, was a retired civilian from a small town in Ohio. This elderly woman had previously mailed a humble $16 donation from her fixed Social Security income to a political campaign. At that moment, nobody in the chamber knew she was there, and nobody would realize her significance until the exact moment it mattered the most. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made her entrance in her customary fashion, projecting an aura that suggested the entire room was incredibly fortunate to simply be in her presence. She dropped her legislative folder onto the desk with a deliberate, soft thud. She meticulously adjusted her microphone closer by a calculated inch. She slowly poured water into her glass, placing the glass in the exact, precise spot she desired. She performed every single one of these actions with a deliberate slowness, embodying the demeanor of a person demanding the entire room watch her display her complete lack of nervousness. Sweeping her gaze across the gathered faces, she confidently concluded, as she always did, that she understood every single individual in that room far better than they could ever understand themselves. When the presiding chairman officially granted her the floor, she seized the opportunity with the fierce energy of a woman claiming the final word in a debate she believed she had been winning for years. She began by directly labeling the environment, boldly claiming the room was filled with individuals who were deeply terrified of mathematical concepts they had never managed to learn. She aggressively asserted that many citizens watching the broadcast falsely believed that managing to save $50 a week transformed them into experts on the national macroeconomic system. She bluntly stated that such budgeting only made them careful, and being careful was absolutely not synonymous with being genuinely intelligent. A chilling, quiet sound rippled through the observing gallery. It was not a gasp, but rather something significantly colder. Maintaining a thin, confident smile, she continued her speech, boldly declaring she would not participate in a charade where people who based their financial literacy on clipping coupons attempted to lecture her on complex economic theories. She grandly positioned herself as the living embodiment of the future, while dismissing her frowning critics across the table as the remnants of a past that had already expired. She haughtily advised the committee not to confuse a legislative hearing with an introductory academic seminar. Leaning back in her chair with immense satisfaction, she felt triumphant. She had just publicly informed every retiree, every frugal saver, and every careful citizen across multiple time zones that their careful management of a single dollar rendered them too simple-minded to comprehend her grand vision. She had delivered this massive insult with a smile, fully believing her rhetorical strike had landed perfectly. If you, the viewer, have ever been condescendingly lectured by an elite individual who has never once been forced to balance their own personal checkbook, someone who assumes you are far too simple to understand your own hard-earned finances, please hit that like button right now. She directed her comments at you on live television, completely intentionally, and she meant every single syllable of her statement. Let us continue watching because the humble country lawyer is preparing to ask her a few essential questions. Senator John Kennedy offered absolutely no visible reaction to her blatant insult. True to his nature, he sat perfectly still with his hands neatly folded and his reading glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose. He possessed the quiet, enduring patience of a seasoned outdoorsman who has spent countless hours sitting in a boat, calmly waiting for a fish that might not even be hungry. He allowed her to completely finish her monologue. He allowed the rapturous applause she so clearly expected to completely fail to materialize. He let the heavy silence stretch a full half-second past the point of comfort, and then allowed it to stretch another half-second further, until the audience genuinely began to wonder if he had even heard her remarks at all. Finally, he leaned forward into his microphone. His very first action was to politely express his gratitude, thanking the Congresswoman and noting that her speech was highly educational. He let the word educational hang in the air, slowly turning it over for emphasis. He stated that he had learned a tremendous amount regarding her true opinions of the ordinary folks who mail her $16 at a time. A scattered few individuals in the room let out a laugh before they could stop themselves, immediately catching themselves and falling dead silent. Kennedy then shifted his tone to brutal honesty. He conceded that she was completely correct about one specific thing. He admitted he was not a brilliant man when it came to her specific, complex brand of economics. He leaned heavily into his persona, calling himself just a simple country attorney from Zachary, Louisiana, where the air conditioning frequently fails and citizens still purchase goods using money they actually possess. He humbly requested that she take on the role of a teacher to help him understand. Stating that he knew her time was incredibly valuable, he promised to set a timer for himself, asking for just 2 short minutes of small, simple questions to help a slower gentleman keep pace with her intellect. She offered a condescending smile and agreed to try her best to keep the concept simple for him. He politely expressed his profound gratitude. Glancing up at the clock mounted on the wall, Kennedy initiated his first minute of questioning. He asked if her prominent slogan regarding taxing the wealthy fundamentally meant that affluent individuals should pay higher rates so that those funds could be redistributed downward to working-class citizens. She proudly confirmed that this concept was indeed the very heart of her platform. Her pride was entirely evident, as she had successfully constructed her entire political career upon that exact premise. Kennedy then moved to his next point, noting that oligarchy was an awfully large vocabulary word for a simple country lawyer, asking her to forgive his ignorance. He asked if fighting the oligarchy essentially meant standing firmly against incredibly powerful people who lived lavish, extravagant lifestyles by taking advantage of citizens who could not afford such luxuries. She enthusiastically agreed that this was the exact definition of her fight. Nodding with the pleased expression of a diligent student receiving a gold star, Kennedy proposed a logical continuation of her philosophy. He suggested that a leader who truly, deeply believed in this cause would naturally live a highly careful and modest life themselves. He painted a picture of a politician who would travel in economy seating, sleep in budget motels where the ice machine is located down the public hallway, and eat the exact same food as the working-class people whose donation checks she was cashing. For the very first time during the hearing, a subtle flicker of realization moved behind her eyes. However, the bright television cameras were locked onto her face. The ideological principle was entirely her own creation, and she simply could not publicly deny her own political gospel on a live national broadcast. When asked if a public servant should live by the standards they preach, she confidently agreed, stating she had never once claimed otherwise. Kennedy praised her fine answer and promised to ask just one final question before he stopped pestering her. He raised a single finger, acting as though a brand new thought had suddenly occurred to him. He presented a hypothetical scenario. If a politician preached one set of values but lived by another, selling careful working-class folks a shirt about taxing the wealthy while personally spending money like a wealthy elite? What would she call that individual? He deferred to her superior fine education, asking her to provide the exact vocabulary word for such behavior. She absolutely should have recognized the impending danger right then and there. Perhaps a small part of her actually did sense the trap closing, but the requested word was far too easy to supply. The entire room was watching her every move, and she had spent her entire political career acting as the ultimate authority who named and defined societal issues. She confidently stated that the correct term was obviously hypocrisy. Kennedy slowly repeated the word hypocrisy, stretching the syllables out as if he were actively committing the definition to memory. He thanked her, stating he would hold on to that specific word. He folded his hands slightly tighter on the desk, and the jaws of his rhetorical trap quietly clicked shut on its very first notch. He explicitly stated he merely wanted to establish her definition on the official record before they truly began, ensuring that nobody could later claim she had been tricked into the admission. He emphasized that she had personally selected the word, that she was proud of it, and that she confirmed she lived by the principles she preached. Instructing her to hold onto that thought incredibly tightly, Kennedy noted they had about 1 minute remaining on the clock. He reached smoothly into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a remarkably thin craft paper envelope. The corners of the envelope had grown soft and frayed from frequent handling. It was not a massive banker's box or a thick, intimidating legal folder. It was simply a heavily worn envelope that a man could easily fit into a single pocket. Upon opening it, the very first item he retrieved was the slogan T-shirt, completely folded into a neat, perfect square. He placed it on the table, smoothing it out with 2 fingers with the gentle care of a man folding his household laundry. He noted aloud that this was an actual piece of merchandise sold in her official online store. He read the price tag out loud, $27. He mathematically pointed out that if an elderly lady sent her a $16 donation, that donor would still be required to somehow locate an additional $11 just to afford the shirt. He solemnly reminded the room that $11 was a very real, significant number for a lot of struggling people. He set the garment down as gently as if he were tucking it into bed. He held up a hand to stop her from answering immediately, noting he still had time left on his clock. He then drew out the first thin sheet of paper from his envelope. He recounted an event from a couple of years prior when she had attended a highly exclusive fancy party in New York City known as the Met Gala. He noted that she wore a borrowed designer dress that famously featured the exact same 3 red words "tax the rich" across the back. Laying the document flat, he dramatically asked for assistance in recalling the price of a ticket to that specific elite gathering, loudly stating the entry fee was an astonishing $35,000. She immediately went on the defensive, interrupting to explain she had been invited as an elected official and did not personally pay for the ticket. Kennedy calmly acknowledged her excuse, smoothly stating he was fully aware that somebody else, a wealthy benefactor, had covered the massive cost. He noted that relying on the wealthy was essentially the main theme of his inquiry, promising they would get to that point shortly. Pulling his glasses down yet another notch, he presented the specific detail that a slower fellow like himself simply could not get past. He revealed that her own colleagues on the Congressional Ethics Committee, members from both political parties, had signed an official finding regarding that night. The committee determined she had explicitly broken the ethics rules and legally mandated that she repay the associated costs. He asked if she remembered the exact amount she owed. The expression on her face made it painfully obvious to everyone watching that she knew the exact number perfectly. Kennedy read the exact figure aloud, $2,733 and exactly 18 cents. Looking up slowly over the rims of his glasses, he admitted that the specific 18 cents was the detail keeping him awake at night. He painted a devastating contrast. A high-profile politician wears a dress protesting wealth inequality to a $35,000 party, and her required penalty is meticulously calculated down to a fraction of a dollar. He confessed he couldn't stop thinking about the actual retirees sitting at home who are genuinely forced to count pennies like that just to survive. A low, uncomfortable sound reverberated through the hearing room, the very first crack in her armor. Kennedy delivered a stinging observation, stating she did not bravely carry a political message into a room full of wealthy elites. Instead, she willingly carried herself into their exclusive space and happily allowed those same wealthy elites to foot the bill for her designer dress. If that specific observation resonated with you, please drop just 2 words in the comment section right now. Type 18 cents and then come right back to the story, because this is the exact moment she attempts to aggressively swing the momentum back in her favor, and for roughly 30 seconds, her strategy actually succeeds. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was highly experienced in this exact type of confrontational situation. She understood this political terrain far better than Kennedy assumed she did. When the rhetorical ground began collapsing beneath her, she resorted to the tactic she utilized most effectively. She completely attempted to change the entire subject of the conflict. She pulled her microphone extremely close to her face, dropping her voice to a low, fast, and intensely furious register. She boldly declared she knew exactly what this hearing was truly about. She vehemently insisted the argument had absolutely nothing to do with a dress or campaign finances. She reframed the entire situation, aggressively stating the confrontation was entirely about a young woman of color, the proud daughter of immigrants, occupying a seat of power that older white men like Kennedy had spent their entire careers desperately trying to keep minorities out of. She accused him of ruthlessly auditing her every single dollar in a discriminatory manner that he had never once applied to any of his male colleagues. She summarized her counterattack forcefully. While he called it financial accountability, she called it a powerful older man, desperately attempting to put a working-class woman firmly back in her subservient place. She claimed that every single viewer who had ever been made to feel small by a powerful figure knew exactly what they were witnessing at that moment. For a brief, fleeting moment, one must give her credit because her emotional appeal felt undeniably real. The entire energy of the room moved alongside her words. It was a clean, practiced emotional punch that had successfully landed in 100 different debate rooms prior to this one, and the refined muscle memory of her delivery was flawless. A nearby reporter's pen began moving frantically across their notepad. A loyal staffer seated directly behind her nodded vigorously twice in agreement. A woman near the front row who had been quietly chuckling just seconds before suddenly looked down at her hands in deep uncertainty, the amusement completely freezing in her throat. The momentum of the hearing had shifted, and it belonged entirely to her once again. The familiar, reflexive current of identity politics surged through the chamber, holding the audience completely captive. It held strong for roughly 30 seconds. It easily might have held the room much longer, but Senator Kennedy absolutely refused to flinch. Kennedy completely failed to do the exact thing her impassioned speech was specifically engineered to force him to do. He absolutely refused to become defensive. He offered zero apologies for his questioning. Most importantly, he never once raised his voice in anger. He simply sat in silence, waiting patiently until she had completely exhausted her tirade. When she finished, he executed a maneuver significantly quieter than anything the room was bracing to endure. He looked up, intentionally shifting his gaze completely past her, focusing entirely on the fourth row of the audience. Maintaining a respectful tone, he stated he was absolutely not going to argue or talk over her regarding her personal identity, noting he wouldn't presume to do so. Instead, he politely informed the committee that there was a specific lady sitting in the back who had formally requested permission to say something before the proceedings began, and the chairman had granted her clearance. Kennedy suggested it was only right she get her turn to speak, primarily because she was the exact type of citizen the Congresswoman continuously claimed to represent. Every single head in the entire hearing room snapped around to look. They saw a remarkably ordinary woman wearing an old cardigan, her hair graying at the temples. She was clutching a mobile phone with a heavily cracked screen, holding it tightly in both hands as if it were an incredibly fragile, breakable object. She stood up very slowly, displaying the careful movements of someone whose joints heavily protested the effort. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of anger. That lack of hostility was the specific element that caused the entire chamber to fall dead silent. She wasn't furious. She simply sounded profoundly exhausted and slightly embarrassed to be standing in front of the cameras. She humbly introduced herself as a nobody from Ohio. She stated plainly that she had mailed the Congresswoman's campaign $16 on 2 separate occasions. She emphasized that this money came directly from her limited Social Security funds, and she had donated it purely because she had genuinely believed the Congresswoman's promises to fight for ordinary people like her. She briefly looked down at her shattered phone screen before looking back up at the panel. She then revealed that she had also purchased the $27 t-shirt, noting she was currently wearing it underneath her sweater if anyone cared to verify, though she did not bother unbuttoning the cardigan. She stated she had only one singular question to ask before she sat back down. She calmly asked if her specific $16 donation had been used to pay for one of the luxurious hotel rooms she had recently been reading about in the news. She repeated that she simply wanted to know if her money was spent on luxury accommodations, and that was all she wanted to know. Having delivered her devastatingly simple query, she sat back down, folded her hands together, and quietly waited for an answer. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez briefly opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it again. There was simply no possible version of her previous, fiery speech regarding powerful old white men and oppressed young women of color that could effectively neutralize an elderly retired woman in a cardigan from Ohio. This donor was literally wearing her campaign merchandise beneath her clothes and was asking a completely valid, fundamental question about where her specific $16 had gone. Right there in the room stood the exact living embodiment of the working-class citizen she aggressively claimed to fight for, asking a simple question she was entirely unable to answer. If you have ever sacrificed your own hard-earned money to support someone who passionately promised to fight for your best interests, only to watch them turn around and live an extravagant lifestyle you could never dream of affording, please subscribe to this channel right now. We have reached the exact point in the narrative where the confrontation stops being about a single expensive dress and completely transforms into the exposure of a consistent, hypocritical pattern. Kennedy allowed the crushing silence to breathe freely within the room. He was remarkably skilled at utilizing silence. It was perhaps his greatest strategic asset. He took an incredibly slow sip from his water glass and placed it back on the desk with a small, highly deliberate click. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, that tiny click was the absolute only sound heard in the entire chamber. Breaking the silence, he remarked that he would absolutely hate to leave the kind lady's question hanging without a proper answer. Since she had specifically asked about the accommodations, he suggested they take a closer look at the hotel rooms. He reached his hand back into the worn craft envelope, pulling out several more thin sheets of paper. He laid them out across his desk one at a time, reading the financial numbers aloud in a flat, completely unembellished tone, exactly as one would recite a mundane grocery list. The raw numbers were devastating enough; they absolutely required no dramatic flair from him. Kennedy revealed that in just the previous year alone, her very own official campaign financial filings, which he gently reminded her, were documents bearing her own name, not his, indicated an expenditure of $53,500 exclusively on luxurious hotels. He specified these were prestigious 4-star and 5-star resorts, absolutely not the type of budget motels where the ice machine is located down a public hallway. Moving methodically to the next page, he brought up a specific political tour she had participated in. He noted the tour had a very specific name, wanting to ensure he got it perfectly correct because it was such a powerful title: the Fighting Oligarchy Tour. Looking up from his papers, he pointed out the supreme irony of her actions. He noted that in order to travel from one city to the next to valiantly fight the wealthy oligarchy, she had chosen to fly on a luxurious private jet, the exact type of aircraft that cost upwards of $15,000 per single hour of flight time. The Congresswoman quickly interrupted, defensively claiming that the private jet was Senator Bernie Sanders' personal travel arrangement, not hers. Kennedy calmly shut down her excuse, pointing out that the federal filings legally proved she was physically present on the airplane. He softly laid the page down on the desk. He then produced the final document, stating it was the specific filing he kept returning to, entirely because of the elderly lady from Ohio. He recounted her trip to Puerto Rico. While visiting the island, she had published a highly emotional, heartfelt video detailing how it completely broke her heart to witness the terrible gentrification occurring, where wealthy elites were moving in and aggressively pricing the native locals out of their own neighborhoods. Pulling the last sheet of paper, Kennedy delivered the crushing reality. During that exact same month, in that exact same location, her political campaign had spent nearly $50,000. This massive sum went toward luxury hotels, premium catering, and a whopping $23,000 fee to rent an exclusive venue located directly adjacent to a massive arena. It was at this specific venue that someone had filmed her joyously dancing inside a luxury VIP suite during a concert. Setting the final paper down, he carefully aligned the folded $27 t-shirt perfectly edge to edge against the stack of financial documents. Honoring her earlier request to keep things completely simple, he summarized the entire situation plainly. He stated that she aggressively sold a $27 piece of merchandise regarding taxing the rich to a vulnerable retiree barely surviving on Social Security. She then took those funds, boarded a private jet, and flew to a five-star luxury hotel just so she could deliver a passionate speech complaining about wealthy elites taking private jets. He spread his hands wide in a gesture of absolute helplessness, perfectly playing the role of a simple man entirely bested by basic arithmetic. Reminding her that he had warned her he was slow, he forcefully stated he was absolutely not so incredibly slow that he couldn't recognize the truth. He declared that the absolute only actual oligarch present in this entire narrative was the specific entity that mailed the elderly Ohio woman the invoice for the shirt. Furious, she lashed out, yelling that his summary was a completely deliberate, bad faith distortion of the facts. Kennedy, maintaining his gentle tone, simply replied that it was her own official filing. He reminded her the numbers were not his invention. They were the exact figures she had personally signed her name to. He emphasized that the massive spending was not a baseless rumor or a subjective opinion, but rather a legally binding federal document featuring her very own signature resting right at the bottom. If you have ever experienced the profound dread of signing your own name to a document you desperately hoped nobody would ever publicly read back to you, you know exactly how heavy that specific silence felt. Please comment the single word "signed" right now, and stay perfectly tuned because the entire room is about to absolutely break. The room did not just offer a polite titter of amusement, it completely fractured into a massive, rolling, entirely helpless wave of genuine laughter. It was the specific type of contagious laughter that completely overtakes a crowd and refuses to let go. It was a chaotic amusement that constantly built upon itself, where people began laughing partly at the sheer absurdity of the situation and partly at each other's reactions. A man seated in the second row desperately attempted to cover his mouth to hide his amusement, but completely failed. A professional reporter burst out laughing, suddenly realized he was being filmed on camera, bit down hard on his lip to stop, but his shoulders continued to uncontrollably shake anyway. Amidst all this chaos, sitting quietly in the fourth row, the elderly lady from Ohio absolutely did not laugh. She merely nodded her head very slightly, as if she had finally received the definitive answer she had been seeking. The profound tragedy of her not laughing was somehow significantly worse than the booming laughter echoing throughout the rest of the room. If you have ever purchased a grand promise from a leader who immediately turned around and lived the exact luxurious lifestyle they explicitly instructed you to be furious about, please share this specific video with one person who will feel it deep within their bones. Just send it to one person, and then come right back, because she is preparing to take her absolute hardest swing of the entire day. And you truly need to witness it, because her final defense almost actually works. Before she could launch her counterattack, Kennedy reached his hand into the worn envelope one final time. This time, the evidence had absolutely nothing to do with finances. He laid down a physical photograph stating he wanted to show her an image rather than a number. He turned the photo completely around so the entire gallery could clearly see it. He explained that the image depicted the congresswoman down south in Alabama, standing before a crowd at a political rally. He recalled how she had stood before the Southern folks and loudly commanded the people living up north to pull up, travel down to Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and physically engage in the political fight. Tapping the photograph gently, Kennedy noted that the South was his home. He stated he had absolutely no quarrel with individuals who wished to visit, but he had a very serious question regarding the glass. When she confusedly asked what glass he was referring to, Kennedy pointed directly at the photograph. He slid the image an inch closer to her face, pointing out that she was standing completely protected behind a massive wall of thick, bulletproof glass. He highlighted the stunning hypocrisy. She had stood entirely protected behind a secure, bulletproof barrier in his home region, aggressively demanding that everyday citizens pull up and throw themselves directly into the dangerous fight. Looking at her intently over the rims of his glasses, every single trace of his folksy country demeanor completely vanished. He bluntly asked if she had ever noticed that every single time she aggressively called for a massive fight, she demanded that somebody else do the traveling, and somebody else stand directly on the dangerous front lines. Meanwhile, she remained completely protected behind a wall of bulletproof glass, hiding safely up in a luxury VIP suite, or flying high above the danger in a private jet. He hammered home the reality that she aggressively ordered the working class to charge into battle while she hid safely behind the glass. He pointed directly at the elderly donor, noting that the lady in the fourth row didn't possess any protective bulletproof glass. She only possessed $16 and a cheap cotton t-shirt. The room fell completely, deadly quiet once again. The lady in the fourth row was staring intently at the photograph as well. One must give the Congresswoman credit. Right up until the bitter end, she absolutely refused to surrender quietly. She straightened her posture rigidly in her chair, and her previous chaotic fury cooled rapidly into a much steadier, highly focused intensity. It was an anger born from a genuinely real place within her past, which was exactly what made her defense sound so incredibly strong. She angrily accused him of attempting to completely reduce her entire life's work down to a single hotel bill. Accepting the challenge, she declared she would tell him exactly who she truly was, since he and his little envelope seemed so incredibly certain. She passionately recounted her deeply difficult history. She described how she had exhaustively waited tables and tended bar. She spoke of standing on painfully swollen feet at the bitter end of a grueling double shift, desperately counting her tiny pile of tips just to see if she possessed enough money to cover the train ride home. She shared the trauma of burying her father at a remarkably young age. She described painfully watching her mother scrub and clean other people's houses just so she could have a tiny shot at a better life. She stared daggers at the senator, declaring she knew the exact heavy weight of a single physical dollar in a profound way that he, with his massive Senate salary and prestigious law degrees, would never, ever have to learn. Her voice didn't rise into a scream. Instead, it grew incredibly quiet and hard as steel. She aggressively commanded him to spare her the entire fake country lawyer act. If he truly wanted to debate who was genuinely fighting for working-class people, she aggressively welcomed the conversation, claiming she had absolutely never been afraid of having that specific fight. Her impassioned defense was undeniably good. For a fleeting moment, it was genuinely, incredibly powerful. A significant portion of the heat and momentum rushed right back into the room, firmly onto her side. A reporter or two paused their frantic scribbling. The heavy, judgmental current in the room noticeably wavered. Even the elderly lady from Ohio looked for a brief second as though she was listening to the defense with deep, careful consideration. Kennedy respectfully allowed her to completely finish her emotional defense. He let the full weight of her entire history land softly in the silent room. And then, he completely removed the gloves. The simple, slow country lawyer persona completely evaporated, and it never returned. Speaking incredibly quietly, causing the entire room to physically lean forward just to catch his words, he stated he believed every single syllable she just said. He validated her entire past, waiting tables, counting tiny tips, burying her father tragically young and watching her mother scrub dirty floors. He solemnly swore he would gladly shake her hand in deep respect for overcoming all of it in any random parking lot in America, and he would entirely mean it. He paused, allowing the validation to sink in before delivering the lethal strike. He stated that her painful history was the exact reason why her current behavior was infinitely worse. The entire room froze in a completely different, much darker kind of silence. He pointed out that because she actually did know the true crushing weight of a single dollar, her actions were utterly inexcusable. He placed one finger directly on the $27 shirt and his other finger directly onto the extravagant luxury hotel bill. He admitted she knew the value of money far better than he ever could. He stated she knew exactly, perfectly well what a mere $16 meant to a struggling woman in Ohio, precisely because she used to desperately count those exact same dollars herself. And yet, fully possessing that intimate knowledge of poverty, she willingly took the woman's money anyway. She aggressively sold her the overpriced merchandise anyway. She willingly flew right over the donor's tiny town in an outrageously expensive $15,000 an hour private airplane anyway, all on her way to deliver a highly paid speech about how the wealthy elites absolutely do not care about the working class. He held his gaze steady. He noted that a man like himself, who was raised comfortably and softly, might potentially commit such hypocritical actions out of sheer, blind ignorance. But she had committed these acts with full, complete knowledge of the pain it caused. He stated she remembered exactly where she came from perfectly well. She simply hoped that the working-class donor would completely forget where she had ultimately gone. Absolutely nobody in the room dared to laugh at that statement. That specific truth went down somewhere significantly deeper than mere amusement. It penetrated into the absolute core of the room where genuine decisions and final judgments are permanently made. Kennedy coldly declared that her lavish lifestyle was absolutely not fighting the wealthy oligarchy. It was simply managing the oligarchy while offering a cheap discount code. She desperately interrupted, attempting to demand respect. Kennedy's voice turned entirely flat, perfectly level and ice cold. He firmly stated they were entirely past the point of mutual respect. He reminded her that respect had died exactly 2 minutes prior, right before she proudly stood up, and publicly told the elderly lady in the fourth row she was far too careful to be genuinely smart. He brutally concluded that the elderly donor had been the truly smart one the entire time, as she was the absolute only person in the entire room who possessed the ability to count correctly. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez desperately searched her mind for any possible words to defend herself, but she found absolutely nothing. Seeing her completely defeated, Kennedy executed his final, devastating move. He picked up the $27 t-shirt. He refolded it once more, perfectly neatly down the exact middle. He slowly slid it completely across the length of the table toward her, pushing it until it rested directly in front of her paralyzed hands. He offered it to her, reminding her it was her property, the merchandise she willingly sold for $27. Sitting back heavily in his chair, he challenged her directly. He commanded her to reach out, pick the shirt up, read the room, and proudly say those 3 words out loud. He demanded she say the exact words she happily plastered across an elderly Ohio lady's chest. If she genuinely still believed in her own political message, he challenged her to pick the garment up right that second and boldly say the slogan directly to the donor's face. The entire room completely stopped breathing. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez slowly reached out for the shirt. Her hand rose up off the table and slowly crossed the tiny distance. Every single television camera in the room instantly zoomed in, tracking her hand's every millimeter of movement. Her hand got incredibly close. It got close enough that her trembling fingers were hovering perhaps a single inch directly above the cheap, white cotton fabric and the 3 glaring red words. And then her hand simply stopped. It completely halted in midair, hanging suspended in the harsh fluorescent lighting exactly 1 inch directly above her very own political slogan. And then, slowly, she pulled it back. She withdrew her hand rapidly, displaying the exact same instinctual reflex of a person pulling away from a burning hot stove they had foolishly forgotten was turned on. She folded both of her hands tightly together in her lap. She absolutely did not pick up the shirt. She absolutely did not say the 3 red words. In fact, she did not say anything at all. When the final, lethal rhetorical shot finally arrived, it was delivered with devastating quietness. Kennedy reminded her that she had personally provided him with the exact vocabulary word right at the very start of the hearing. He asked if she remembered defining the word. He waited 2 full, agonizing seconds before delivering the final verdict. He stated she absolutely didn't tax the rich. She happily joined them. He paused once more before adding the final nail. And she sent the working class the bill. The chairman uncomfortably cleared his throat into the dead silence and formally asked if the congresswoman wished to officially respond. She absolutely did not wish to respond. That specific visual of her trembling hand, stopping exactly 1 inch directly above her very own merchandise on a live national television broadcast, inside a massive room so perfectly quiet you could literally hear a pin drop, and then cowardly pulling back, that is the exact, undeniable sound of a massive political brand entirely breaking apart. There is absolutely no audible sound to it whatsoever. And that profound silence is exactly what makes it the absolute loudest thing in the entire world. If that devastating conclusion gave you chills, make sure to turn on your notifications right now so you absolutely do not miss what occurred after the television cameras finally turned off. The room quickly emptied out, but the massive story certainly did not stop there. Please stay with me to hear the conclusion. 2. The provided text describes the immediate and devastating aftermath of a congressional hearing where a prominent congresswoman failed to pick up her own campaign merchandise. A short video clip of her trembling hand hovering over the shirt quickly goes viral, completely shifting public attention away from complex political debates and on to her undeniable public humiliation. Major news networks broadcast the frozen frame of her hesitation, while an anonymous Democratic colleague admits that her hypocritical spending habits were a known issue that her party could no longer defend. Meanwhile, the elderly Ohio donor who confronted her quietly travels back home in a middle coach seat, feeling she fulfilled a heavy duty to millions of other small donors by finally demanding the truth. Upon returning to her quiet home, she respectfully folds the campaign shirt she once believed in and buries it at the bottom of a drawer, choosing to never wear the symbol again. Senator Kennedy, maintaining his calm and unassuming country lawyer persona, simply packs his evidence away and leaves the room in total silence, having successfully used simple math and patience to expose the truth. The narrative then concludes with a direct call to action, asking viewers to like, subscribe, and share the video to support working-class citizens and demand accountability from elite politicians who exploit small donors.